Hello, friends. We'll be talking about the Canterbury Tales today by Geoffrey Chaucer. Specifically, we will talk about the general prologue part of the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is a medieval work. Specifically, it's from the Middle English period. So, in our previous lessons, we had talked about Anglo-Saxon period or Old English period, but now we will be talking about the Middle English period, and probably the best known work of literature during the medieval age, during medieval English literature, is the Canterbury Tales. It's widely known and widely read by many people even today. So it's actually a collection of stories, actually. But the general prologue part is like an introduction by Geoffrey Chaucer. It's a general introduction to the rest of the stories. So the thing about the Canterbury Tales is that a group of pilgrims decide to visit the grave of a holy person, Thomas Becket. And before they set on their journey, they decide to meet at a tavern, and the writer Geoffrey Chaucer decides to introduce each character to us in the general prologue part. So let's start by giving some historical and biographical context to Geoffrey Chaucer. So he was born in 1343 in London, and he died in 1400 in London, and he's a poet. So the thing about Geoffrey Chaucer is that he's called as the father of English poetry. So what does this mean? It means that Geoffrey Chaucer is the person who actually revived the English language. What I mean is, before Geoffrey Chaucer, not a lot of people, not a lot of English artists regarded English language as the language of art. So instead of using English language, they used French language. Why is that? Because the Anglo-Saxon period ends in 1066 with the invasion of England by the Normans. Normans are a group of people from France. They came from Normandy, and William the Conqueror, who is a Norman duke, decided to invade England, and he invaded England. He was successful in his campaign, and he became the first Norman king of England. And gradually, William the Conqueror replaced the Anglo-Saxon dukes, which were ruling in England at the time. And because he was from Normandy, Normandy is a part of France, is a place in France, he spoke French, and the court language of the English kingdom became French. So the notes were, for example, the royal notes were taken in the French language. So at this time, three languages were existing in England. So the members of the clergy spoke in Latin, the royalty spoke in French, but the common people, I mean, the rest of the people spoke in English. So Chaucer was actually knowledgeable in many other languages apart from English. He spoke French, English, Italian, and Latin, and he was also familiar with all those literatures. So he was able to combine some aspects of each literature. I mean, French literature, English literature, Italian and Latin literatures into his works. And because Chaucer decided to write this work in the English language, and because this work became so popular, he's considered, or he is called, the father of English poetry. So he was born in England. He was born in London. He was his parents were wine merchants, and he saw three kings: Edward III, Richard II, and Henry IV. So the first time that we see his name in a document is in 1357. Is in 1357. He became a page in the service of Elizabeth, the Countess of Ulster. So what does a page mean? A page is like a servant. Okay, so this term is actually important because it's a page is actually the first step when you decide to become a knight. Okay, and you know the knights, I mean the chevaliers, or the riders, the horse riders, the fighter, the soldiers who ride on a horse, knight. In Turkish we call them as şövalye, right? So in order to become a knight, I mean, you don't immediately become a knight. So there are three steps. First, as a very young child, you become a page. A page is somebody who is a servant, and then to the knight. And then comes the squire. Squire is one step ahead of the page and one step below the knight, which means that the squire is actually responsible for taking care of the weapons or the horses of the knight. Okay, so in 1357 he became a page in the service of Elizabeth, the Countess of Ulster, who is also the wife of Prince Lionel, who is also the third son of Edward III, the king. So he attended the 100 Years' War. What's the 100 Years' War? That was a war. So as I have just told you, England was invaded by the French. So when Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, conquered England, so he still had his lands in France as well. So now the King of England becomes William the Conqueror, but he has all those lands left in France as well. So as a result, but he did not become the King of France. Okay, so there's a separate King of France, and then there's the King of England, who also has lands in France. So this is a problem because there's no national unity in France. So the English kings, after William the Conqueror, decided to claim that they have actually some right they have a claim on the French throne. So a big war happened. It started as a result of the English claim on France. So it was a very long war, and that's why it's called 100 Years' War. Okay, and it persisted throughout the 14th century. But in the end, England was unsuccessful, and France stayed as a separate kingdom. All right, so during this war, as I have just told you, during this war, Chaucer fought in this war as well, of course, in the English side. But he was captured. And the English king contributed to his ransom. A ransom is the money that you have to pay in order to get free. So let's talk about John of Gaunt. So John of Gaunt. Let's start by his marriage. In 1366, Chaucer married Philippa Pan, a woman, I mean a courtier. A courtier is somebody who lives in the court and serves either as a maid or a servant or a poet or a soldier, anyone who is in the service of the king. Okay, So it's a general name for any person who lives in the court. So Philippa Pan was a courtier who was also in the service of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster. So both Chaucer and Philippa Pan were servants to the same woman. So this countess was actually the wife of John of Gaunt, and John of Gaunt was Edward III's fourth son. So you remember in the previous slide, we learned that Chaucer was in the service. He started his work in the service of Edward III's third son, but now he became the servant of Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was a powerful man, and even though he was not the king, he was actually behind the shadows, the actual power behind the throne. So he was not the official king, but he acted like the king because he was much more powerful than the actual king. So John of Gaunt becomes Chaucer's patron. A patron is somebody who pays you money for your service. Okay, so Chaucer did not start his career as a writer actually. So he spoke many languages and he traveled extensively around Europe. So he became like a traveling representative for John of Gaunt, let's say. Okay, so by around those times, a big event started in Europe. It's called the Black Death, which is the plague. Okay, bubonic plague. In Turkish, we call it veba. So the plague started in Asia during the Mongol invasions of Europe, during the Mongol Golden Age. And how did that start? So the Mongols were in Central Asia and they started invading all the neighboring kingdoms, and they had a very interesting tactic. The Mongols came at the doors of a city, for example, and then they told them to surrender. So if the city surrendered, they just captured it. If they did not, they started their attack. And they had a moral weapon as well. Okay, they tried to break the morale of the cities. And this weapon was like they loaded the corpses, the dead bodies, on a trebuchet, and they threw the dead bodies into the cities. Okay, and these dead bodies actually started causing illnesses, which became the bubonic plague. Okay, so the dead people, the bodies actually made living people sick. So this sickness, the bubonic plague, started traveling to the other cities, and it reached Europe in the 14th century, in mid 14th century, and people guess that it killed 1/3 of all the people living in Europe. So John Gaunt's first wife, the Duchess of Lancaster, died as a result of the plague. Okay, so why is that important? Because Chaucer wrote a very famous book. It's called the Book of the Duchess. The Book of the Duchess is actually written for John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was very sad that he had lost his wife, and that's why Chaucer wrote him a book in order to make him happy again. So this book is about the Duchess, and it's called the Book of the Duchess. So, but the thing about the Book of the Duchess is that it doesn't seem like a translation. What does it mean? As I have said at the beginning, most of the writers, most of the poets at that time did not write in the English language. They wrote in French. Why did they choose writing in French instead of English? Because the nobility, for example, John of Gaunt, spoke French. So, and the nobility is your patron. You are an artist and you have a patron. Your patron, your boss, let's say, speaks in French, and you cannot write him a book in English, because English is not considered as a good language. The French has a higher position among the nobility. But this book was written in English, and it doesn't seem like a translation English. I mean, it's unique. I mean, it's written in English, and the beauty of the English language is taken into account when this book was written in. Okay, that's why this book is important. So, as I have said before, Chaucer traveled a lot, and his main the main destination of his travels was Italy. So he traveled to Genoa, he traveled to Florence, and all the big cities. And at that time, Renaissance was actually starting in Italy. Okay, so Renaissance started in Italy first. And then throughout the centuries, it spread to the rest of Europe. So at the time when Chaucer lived, England was, or English people were still living in the Middle Ages. But Chaucer traveled to Italy, and he saw all these different kinds of people, and he became familiar with the literature of Italy, with Italian literature and Italian language, and that's why he was affected by all those different cultures as a result of his travels. And we can see the effects of these travels in the Canterbury Tales as well. All right, one major theme of Canterbury Tales is the church corruption. What is the church corruption? So at that time, there was only, in Europe, let's say, at least in Europe, there was only one single church. That was the Catholic Church. Of course, in the rest of Europe, or in the rest of the world, there were other churches as well. For example, the Orthodox Church was also there as well. And the center of the Orthodox Church was Constantinople. Or there were different Christian churches in Africa as well. But most of the Europe actually belonged to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was widely perceived as corrupt in some ways, because, for example, there were many corrupt priests within the church, within the Catholic Church. And what Chaucer does in the Canterbury Tales is that he actually criticizes these corruptions in a veiled way, in a secret way. So he does not directly attack the church. He does not do that, but he implies, he satirizes the corruption in the church. How do we see this? For example, we can see that some of the pilgrims that he introduces us in the book, in the Canterbury Tales, are actually very corrupt people. Okay, for example, the friar, the summoner, the pardoner. These are all very corrupt people, and they actually serve the Catholic Church. That's what he does in the Canterbury Tales. He tries to criticize the church in a subtle way, in a hidden way. Okay. Okay, bawdy humor. So bawdy means rude. Okay, rude. It's kind of, so there are a lot of sexual jokes, sexual humor, or bad words. Okay, or sexual words or erotic parts in many of those stories within the Canterbury Tales. So as I have said, he uses the English language, And Chaucer writes this work, the Canterbury Tales, for the English-speaking people, the common man, okay, the regular man, the ordinary man. He does not write this for the nobility. So the nobility would probably not like such rude jokes. But the common people, they have lower standards, of course, and they like these kinds of rude jokes and erotic tales, okay, funny tales. So one hypothesis is that because the bubonic plague, the bubonic plague, and because of the Hundred Years' Wars, I mean, Europe, the European people, or specifically the English people, were in a very unhappy state. Okay, so that's why when they read those stories, when they read the Canterbury Tales, they liked it, okay, because they already had no morale. So these stories lifted their spirits. All right. So as I have said, so he had that. I mean, at around we said that Chaucer saw three kings, and these kings actually did not get on well with each other, and so the transition of power from one king to the other was not actually very smooth. And so Chaucer, as a result, because Chaucer was working for the kings, he had his own problems as well. Okay, so when a new king comes, for example, the new king doesn't like Chaucer because Chaucer was working for the old king. So, but then eventually, I mean, he was a clever guy, and he was a likable guy, and so he tried to get in the good side of all of those kings that he worked for. But I mean, his wife was not very stable. Okay, I mean, he had his ups and downs. So he was buried in Westminster Abbey because that's where his home was. He had bought a house in Westminster Abbey, and when he died, he was buried there. And sometime later, his grave, around his grave, let's say, around his grave, many other poets were also buried as well. And it became the Poets' Corner, which is actually still there. Okay, it's a famous place in the Westminster Abbey. It's a graveyard where famous English poets are buried. All right. So let's talk about his major works. So the Book of the Duchess. You can see here in this slide the approximate dates of their writing. The Book of the Duchess, the Parliament of Foes, Troilus and Crusade, and the Canterbury Tales. So the Canterbury Tales is actually his last work, and he died before completing all the tales. So his actual plan was like this. So the story, the book, the Canterbury Tales, starts with a general prologue. A prologue is an introduction. So in the introduction, he introduces us all the characters. And Chaucer himself is also a character in the Canterbury Tales as well. So they decide to set on a pilgrimage. They decide to visit the grave of Thomas à Becket. Thomas à Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury Cathedral, who was murdered. And because he was murdered, he was declared a saint later by the Catholic Church. So these people decide to visit the grave of Thomas à Becket, and before they start their pilgrimage, they meet in a tavern, and Chaucer is one of those characters, and Chaucer introduces us each character who is taking on the pilgrimage. So, and then after the prologue, the general prologue part ends, Chaucer, each character starts telling a tale, a story. What's the point? of those. I mean, why do they tell stories? They tell stories so that, I mean, I mean, they make a bet. Okay, they say we are going to tell one story. I mean, each of us is going to tell one story before we start our journey, and then each person is again going to tell a story on the back journey. And the person who tells the best story is going to win, is going to be rewarded with a meal, okay, with dinner, for example. So that's the bet, actually. But Chaucer dies before completing these stories. So each character was supposed to tell two stories, one story on the way to Canterbury and one story on the way back from Canterbury. But Chaucer dies before he is able to complete it. All right, so he wrote in the vernacular literature. Vernacular means the mother tongue of the place that that we are speaking about. So the vernacular language is English in England. So English language, as I have just told you before, was not considered as a literary language. It was seen as a rough language. Okay, it was spoken by the common people, by the villagers, by the peasants, by the ordinary people, because the nobility spoke in French and the clergy, the members of the church, spoke in Latin. But Chaucer wrote this one in English language. Frame narrative is an important concept. A frame narrative is a story within a story. What does that mean? So each, as I have just told you, each character in the Canterbury Tales starts to tell a story. For example, who are some of these characters? For example, knight. There's a knight. There's a squire. There's a monk. The monk the knight tells a story, and this story is the first story. But the general story, the actual story, is that all of these people are sitting in a tavern telling those stories. All right, so there are two stories. The first story is that the pilgrims are sitting in a tavern, and the second story is that each character in the tavern starts telling a story within a story. This technique is called a frame narrative. Okay, so there are other examples of frame narratives in European literature as well, and maybe most important and most well known, even better known than the Canterbury Tales, is the Decameron by Boccaccio. Okay, so as we have said, Chaucer actually traveled a lot during his lifetime. So it is possible that Chaucer might be familiar with some of the tales in the Decameron. Okay, but critics do not think that Chaucer was familiar with Boccaccio, or they don't think that he was familiar with all stories in the Decameron, but probably he was familiar with some of the stories. In the Middle Ages, there's one thing that you should know about authorship. So today, for example, in the 21st century or before that, even, I mean, when you buy a book, you can see on the cover, I mean, who wrote this book, right? So each poem, each novel is, I mean, written comes with the name of the author. But during the Middle Ages, the authors, the poets, did not think about like this. So they did not care about being known. Okay, so when books were published, I mean, most of the time, the names of the poets, the names of the authors were not even recorded. They were not written down. Or or writers stole ideas. Poets stole poems from each other as well. And this was not a bad thing for anyone. Okay, this was completely normal because they did not think that authorship was important. All right. So yeah, we can also mention Plato as well. Plato's Symposium. I mean, a very early work, an ancient Greek work written around 385 before Christ. This work, for example, is also written in a frame narrative style. But again, just like Boccaccio's The Decameron, it's doubtful that Chaucer was familiar with Plato's work. So, but he mentions Plato somewhere in his writings, but it doesn't seem like he actually read anything but about Plato. But we know that he heard about Plato. Okay, so and the rest of the things that you see on the slide, Mary Shelley, for example, Frankenstein, written in 1818, or Mark Twain, the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. These works all use the frame narrative technique. Okay, a story within a story. It's a very famous method. And finally, let's talk about Chaucer's famous contemporaries. Contemporary means somebody who lived around the same time as somebody else. Okay, so when Chaucer lived, which other famous poets were around? So the first one is Boccaccio, of course. The most famous one is Boccaccio, the writer of the Decameron. He was an Italian writer. The other famous writer was Petrarch. He was he was a poet, and he invented the sonnet form. A sonnet form. I mean, we are going to talk about what the sonnet is. It's a special kind of poem. Okay, and Petrarch's sonnets were actually introduced to English literature later as well. So, but it started in Italy. So William Langland was an English writer. His most famous work is Piers Plowman. It's a religious work, actually. So it's not actually straightly religious, but it's a metaphorical and allegorical poem. Uh, so it takes its subject from a normal person, but this person or the things that happen to this person actually represent a religious story. That's how I can explain clearly. You are going to read a work by William Langland next year. And the other ones are Wat Tyler. So he was the leader of the peasants' revolt. I mean, in 1381, there was a great protest against the English king, King Richard II. It was a peasants' revolt because of the high taxes. As you remember, it was the time of the Hundred Years' Wars, I mean, between England and France, and the common people suffered. The peasants suffered as a result. So they rebelled, but then the rebellion was put down. And the other one is John Gower, who was a poet, but he did not write in English language. I mean, he did not write only in English language. He wrote in French, Latin, and English. So that's all I want to talk about Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales.